Can your investments have a positive impact on the world? At Standard Chartered, we believe money can be a force for good. Through your sustainable investments with us, we're financing hospitals that are the heartbeat of local communities, funding clean energy to make electricity more accessible, and investing in innovative solutions to clean polluted marine habitats. Sustainable investments that benefit you and parts of the world that need it most. We're Standard Chartered, and we're here for good.
Hello and welcome. You are watching Standard Chartered's Global Credit Conference 2021. Good to have you with us. I'm Manisha Tank, and I'm very much looking forward to our next panel today. We are talking about the carbon industry and its shift to net zero. The world will need to be turned upside down. We're going to be finding out just why and how that's going to be happening. Joining me for this panel, we have Chris Leeds, who is Executive Director of Energy Sales for Standard Chartered, joining me from London. And we also have Dr. Steve Howard, who's Chief Sustainability Officer for Temasek, the sovereign wealth fund that is based here in Singapore. Thank you, gents, for joining me both. Steve, remind me, where in the world are you at the moment?
I'm currently in the Netherlands. I'm sort of split between Europe and Singapore.
Ah, okay. And I can share with our audience that we, off camera, we're having the usual sort of very European chat about the weather. But we are having to think about much more than just weather. We're thinking about our climate as a whole and our planet, of course, aren't we, gents? Actually, let me flag then, as we get this conversation underway, a recent, very groundbreaking report, really, from the International Energy Agency, all about this path to net zero by 2050. This was a very comprehensive report that came out, and it's really all around what is it that governments really need to do, to the extent to which we need to turn things upside down to reach these net zero goals. Of course, if we don't do it, there is a severe threat in terms of limiting the world's rising temperatures to just 1.5 degrees by 2050. So let's kick it off there. Chris, I'd like to start with you. We have spoken very energetically and very enthusiastically about lots of positives and lots of things that can be done. But I think this IEA report has been quite a stark one, and it shows us how high this mountain is that needs to be climbed.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think it's really interesting that the IEA report itself, which is a forecast of what we need to do to get to net zero by 2050, differs from the IEA's own expectations of where we will be in 2050 today. So the report on what we need to do to get to net zero says that by 2050 the consumption or supply of oil by the oil industry needs to be about 25 million barrels a day. Well, their actual forecast in their standard report, the one that they produce every month for the industry that looks that's looking forward out to 2050, says that they expect oil consumption to be around, well, certainly in excess of 100 million barrels a day, not far off where it is today. So clearly there's something wrong in that equation, and there's obviously quite a lot that needs to happen, that we need to reduce carbon emissions just coming from oil by 80 million barrels a day. So it's a considerable change that we're going to be seeing, and obviously that is going to have a massive impact on all of the oil companies that are currently producing oil and making money from doing that. So they're going to have to, as we say at the title, they're going to have to turn their business models upside down, and we are seeing that to a certain extent from some of the oil companies who are desperately trying to change their business model and to become greener, some more quickly than others. And we saw, I think, last week the announcement in the Netherlands about Shell having to move more quickly, certainly in the Netherlands, in terms of getting to net zero, having targets around getting to reducing their emissions by 2030. So while they are trying to make changes, it's clear compared to where certainly some of the legislators and the lawmakers see them, they're not going as quickly as perhaps they should be. And then we also saw Exxon. There were two new board members who were elected to the board who are coming from the environmental lobby. So again, this is quite a big change. So we need to do an awful lot to get us to those targets of net zero by 2050, but we need to go quicker. So there is a lot of acknowledgement that things need to be done, but clearly from what the IEA is saying, and when you look at some of the other statistics in there, we need to move even quicker. I think the good news is, again, reading that report, that much of the technology that we need exists already. So it's actually about applying that and applying it more quickly. Yes, there will need to be new technologies, and there's an expectation that we'll see funding coming into those technologies to accelerate their path to scale and to being able to provide the energy that we need in a low carbon way. But there is a lot that we can do now, and we're seeing that. We're seeing that on the. We're seeing that around the transition to low carbon energy generation. So we're seeing that with renewables. We're seeing that with the likes of solar and wind. We're seeing that with biomass. There's a lot of opportunities out there for us to be able to reduce those emissions in line with what they are, what we need to do to get to those net zero targets.
Okay, so lots of options about what can be done, and we're going to dig a little bit deeper in just a moment on some of the what and also the how. Before we do, I want to remind our audience, our global audience, that you can join in this conversation. Do send in any questions. There is a bar to the right of your screen that allows you to do that, a Q&A icon, and we will weave those questions into the conversation as we go. I've got my trusty iPad here, and I will be checking in to see what it is you've had to say and what it is you want to know more about. Speaking of knowing more about it, let's check in with you, Steve, because you joined Temasek, of course, the Sovereign Wealth Fund, some months ago, and I'm sure it's been, everything firing off on all cylinders in terms of achieving these goals that Chris has already been outlining. And something else Chris has been outlining is just the number of options, so many options. I suppose that Temasek, with its global footprint, you are already getting exposure to the many ways in which we can make this movement towards net zero in the energy sector.
Yeah, well, of course, Manisha, it's wider than the energy sector as well. If you think we're now going through these really deep transitions that cut across the whole economy. And I thought the IEA report was interesting because, as Chris said, it talked about, Chris mentioned that most of the technologies exist already. So IEA said we need to have a 3 to 4-fold increase in the rate of solar installation by the end of the decade. But we had a 10-fold increase in the previous decade in solar. So we've scaled technologies like this before. The numbers get bigger, obviously, as you keep on doing that. But these are realistic, stretch targets now that we have. And so if you could say the energy transition is really well underway. And it's clear now that, by the end of this decade, if solar is 60, 70% cheaper, we have breathtakingly cheap, abundant renewable energy available to many people. That's very optimistic from that point of view. Wind's going in a similar pattern as that. So the renewable future is well underway, and that transition's advanced. And you can see the disruption that's now having on energy systems. Mobility transitions accelerating as well, because again, economies of scale, energy storage that we can see, battery prices just improving in terms of energy density and in terms of cost faster than previously predicted. And this is a point that's worth noting. If we look at historical projections, whether they were from development banks, from the IEA itself, always under-predicted the rate of change. So, in fact, we looked at lots of studies. 2-3 years ago, there was one of my favorite charts, looked at lots of different predictions around the rate of renewables expansion. And everybody got it wrong and underestimated it, except for Greenpeace. You don't see many financial analysts sort of reaching out for a Greenpeace report to predict the future. And you could actually systematically correct the IEA predictions by 8% every year, and then they sort of kind of got more accurate, so they underpredicted the future. So the mobility, and the other thing with these, you have to look at customers as well and consumers in these. So we can look at a very sort of economist's view of how does technology shift. But then when you get shifts in business behavior, business perceptions, consumer perceptions, so everybody can see, okay, 100% renewable energy is a realistic target for many businesses now. There's 300 businesses have signed up for that. There's if you're a driver of vehicles, your next car is likely to be an EV. Most people are now thinking, yeah, probably my next car's an EV. That will drive a dislocation in the mobility industry. Food and ag's also underway. There's the revolution in food and agriculture as we move from the sort of intensive input-driven model of agriculture to decentralized agriculture, vertical farming, regenerative farming, a massive increase in plant-based foods. I mean, Temasek was early actually investing into plant-based food. Companies like Impossible Foods or the milk producer Califia or Perfect Day. And you can see a shift again with consumers now choosing more of there's people are flexitarians, climavores. I've not heard of a climavore before, a climate-friendly diet. So there's people choosing, they're not necessarily giving meat up full time, but they're actually switching to much more plant-based diets. And many of the sort of generations X, Y, Z are actually going all the way and really opting to be vegan or vegetarian within that. So these are driving complete restructuring of industries. And so we see that as an investment firm. We see that from an opportunity point of view, also working with our large portfolio companies. We look at how do companies transition? So how do we transition the existing economy? And in fact, 2 announcements this week. Singapore Airlines just announced that they're going for a net zero by 2050 target. It's a stretch target for them, so that's ahead of the pace of the aviation sector as a whole to do that. And Sembcorp, the power company, the energy company, announced very ambitious targets to increase their renewables capacity dramatically, to shift where their revenue comes from brown to green this decade with a dramatic reduction in emissions. And that's really choosing to step in and future-proof your businesses. So I think this is something, if you're a business leader or you're an investor now, I think you have to say, unless you're tied to legacy assets, which are very difficult to get away from, it's a very exciting time to look to the future.
Yeah, and it's really interesting that you've cited those 2 examples, which are Singaporean examples, Sembcorp Marine and also Singapore Airlines. The reason I want to draw focus to Singapore is this initiative in conjunction with Standard Chartered, DBS Bank and SGX. It's called SIX for short. Steve, can you perhaps tell us a little bit more about this? Temasek, of course, is involved, and how important this is in terms of your outlook on sustainability.
Well, we can see that carbon markets are going to become ever more important, and we're all committed. So we've come together with the 4 companies you mentioned, so with Standard Chartered, with DBS, with the Singapore Exchange and ourselves, to help set up this Climate Impact Exchange. And the Climate Impact Exchange is there to help build trust and liquidity in carbon markets. You could see if what we know through the sort of technologies we've just been touching on, we can absolutely take a big slice of the chunks of emissions out of our energy, built environment, mobility systems, and the food and ag sector. But there's going to be residual emissions with our best efforts. So we will need to sort of neutralize those through carbon removals. And the carbon removals will be through carbon capture and storage, through regenerative agriculture, through afforestation, reforestation. And there you need liquidity in those markets. And we need to get going with that now. And those opportunities are there now to really remove CO2 and greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. So the climate index exchange is designed to promote those. There's also the sort of category of emissions that the avoided emissions that we can have from preventing deforestation on a scale, and the sort of natural climate solutions as a whole category. And we need to have capital flows there. And again, this is something we can make a bigger impact faster. And it's really heartening to see the voluntary carbon markets as well as the compliance markets really starting to scale as companies are looking at how do you neutralize the unavoidable emissions and compensate the emissions while you're transitioning. And so we're really excited about this initiative. And I think it really shows this is deep collaboration between the four partners. And we'll have more partners over time because we see this is not, this will be a commercial enterprise, but this is primarily, we see this as vitally important strategy to get carbon markets moving and carbon flowing and high trust in this initiative. And that's a critical pathway towards the sort of net zero world. I don't know, Chris, you've been equally involved in this. What do you think about CIX?
I'm really pleased that we're involved, and it's very much aligned with what Standard Charter's been doing with the task force for scaling voluntary carbon markets, and certainly that's something we hope to be able to continue with this collaboration. So as you say, what we're trying to do is to scale these markets and to allow capital to come in and help with carbon emissions reductions and avoidance, which can happen now. I think that's the important thing to say, is that many companies want to decarbonise as quickly as possible. And while there are many companies that can do it very quickly, others are going to be in hard to abate sectors, and it's just not going to happen overnight. And we want them to be able to do things, and by being able to put money into projects like this, and particularly, as you say, natural capital solutions, it's going to allow that transition to happen more quickly. And I think that's what's really important to understand. And I think the other thing about the voluntary carbon markets, as you say, this is a private sector led initiative. And I think really what's happened is Singapore has at the same time as the task force has been growing, been working on this, and we've then come together and been able to collaborate. And I think, again, that's fantastic. And that's what we need. We need to see many collaborations like this around the world to grow these markets. And then to establish a carbon price that we're going to start to see much more transparently around the world. We know that there are a number of, as you say, compliance markets around the world, and probably the most well-known compliance market and the most liquid compliance market is the European Emissions Trading Scheme. Now, we're seeing prices there for carbon at in excess of €50 a tonne. Whereas prices in the voluntary market are still between 5, 10, 15. We don't really know because there isn't enough liquidity and transparency there. And that's, again, one of the things that we want to do through the exchange, is to be able to shine that light of transparency on the different projects out there, and hopefully see these carbon prices start to converge and become more global. Because then when you've got a carbon price that is a global carbon price, it allows everybody to understand what you need to do to be able to make those emissions reductions. You then know what the cost of carbon is, what you need to move from a high carbon intensive scheme to a low one, to move to renewables. So I think that's one of the important things about developing these markets. Not only are we going to get capital into projects where they wouldn't get to otherwise, and into the nature-based solutions, avoiding deforestation, allowing for reforestation, afforestation, as you say, peatland wetting, blue carbon, all of these other fantastic projects that need capital. Will get that capital once you've got the liquidity in these markets. But it will also enable the high emitters to be able to see how much the costs of emitting are actually the impact that's having and what they need to do to change. And you can then compare using renewable electricity versus using non-renewable electricity, because there will be that price differentiation. So I think that's something that's really important that we start to see develop more around the world.
So, Chris, let's take this benefit of transparency a little bit further. We're getting a raft of questions, actually, on how you make sure that you have a more efficient and equitable system when it comes to voluntary carbon markets. So Chris, for example, we've had one question, this was posted anonymously. There are many net zero targets by corporates, though many do not back it up with enough details or plans. Is this trend of declaration with insufficient details going to do more harm than good? I think there's a really good point here, isn't there, around the benefits of, initiatives like SIX in actually bringing the data to the fore so that we can measure impact, so that we can see what's happening, and that sort of information is more widely available.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think going back to that point about net zero targets without any kind of interim targets, I agree. I think we need to see many more interim targets that can demonstrate that a company or a country indeed is on a path to net zero. So it's all well and good setting a net zero target of 2050, but without any metrics on that pathway, it's very difficult to determine if that company is actually doing what it says it's going to do. And so I think we are going to see more of that. Standard Chartered, we announced that we were going to be net zero on our financed emissions by 2050, but we said at the same time we don't actually have a clear path on how we're going to get there, but we are going to work on that, and we're going to then announce, have further announcements and further details on that later on this year, and we've committed to do that. So we're working on that transition pathway right now. What is it that we need to do to be able to demonstrate that we're actually on the path, and that we can make those credible claims? And many of the initiatives that we're working with, both the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets, the Science-Based Targets Initiative, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative, a number of these different initiatives are looking at how companies can also demonstrate that pathway. So it's not good enough just to say, I'm going to be net zero in 2050. It's how you're going to get there. And again, exchanges like Climate Impact X can help give that transparency. At the moment, it's mainly going to be around the supply side in terms of the actual emissions reductions. But I think over time, we'll then be able to measure how companies are actually making those reductions and how they are committing to them. So we need more data. We need more information around Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3 emissions. Now, again, these might be somewhat technical terms to some people, but this is the idea of being able to measure Scope 1, the direct emissions, Scope 2, the indirect emissions within a company's value chain, and then Scope 3, everything else basically that sits outside of a value chain. So for an individual, it might be their flights that they're taking. For an oil company, it's the oil that's being burned by us in the cars that we drive, or indeed, obviously, the aircraft that we fly in. So it's just making sure that we can see all of that information, and we can see how big the problem is, and how people are actually tackling it and making it moving to that net zero world.
Can I just come in on that, Manisha? I think the sort of net zero. I think if we sort of dial back, because I think I don't think Chris or I, I'm speaking for you, Chris, on this, but that, if we go back 3 years ago, would we have believed that there'd be nearly 2,000 companies that global companies set science-based targets and net zero commitments? I don't think we would. It's been an incredible change, and the actually setting out an ambition to start off with, I think we have to welcome that. So if you're a company and you haven't set a target like that, set the target, but I'll draw a line in the sand. And then develop hard plans and publish your plans and that. In Temasek, for our portfolio, we've got the net zero target, but perhaps more importantly, we've got to halving our emissions against 2010 levels by 2030. And we've measured those. We're laying in plans. We've got dialogue with our portfolio companies. We don't know how all of those transitions are going to happen over the next 8-9 years, but we're working on the plans. So the shorter term milestones. But I think overall, we have to say, we have to really welcome this movement by this global business movement to set ambitious targets, and particularly the sort of science-based targets, which do have more measurability behind them. You can see there's a push now, this sort of 50 by 30. You could say there's a normalizing of people looking at halving emissions by 2030, which is, and that's a real stretch for some, and it's not for others. But that keeps us on pace for staying under a 1.5-degree world. And obviously, if you're a business leader, then those are much more, you have to, it's about today's investment decisions. They have direct impact on what happens in 2030. Your operational decisions today have consequences in that time frame. So I think we'll see a sharpening of that. There is a discussion around the net, and this gets into the weeds a little bit, but it's really fundamentally important. So we're not talking zero, we're talking net. That's something where things like climate impact exchange comes in and the sort of offsets. And I think we will have a big debate around what's the level of where can those be applied? What are the really incredibly hard to abate emissions that you just need to neutralize by investing in removals of emissions elsewhere? And there's a finite capacity for those removals. So there will be debate. We'll see clarity around that. And let's have that discussion, I think.
Yeah, Steve, speaking of debate, I want to bring up one of the other questions that we've just received, this one again, anonymous. It's a good point, and this was referring back to a point that Chris made. It's a good point about measuring scope 1 to 3 emissions, though it's incredibly hard to do. Opportunity is massive, though. MNCs and more transparent, sustainable supply chains can make a difference. The question is, how do we feasibly make this happen? And I also want to extend out that question to the fact that, you yourself, Steve, and Chris also, and myself, we've been referring to this as a global movement for change, a global wish to turn things upside down. But is it really global? Because there are some countries, there are some parts of the world, emerging economies, for example, for whom it's not so easy to do. This really gets to the heart of the feasibility of making things happen. Steve, with Temasek's exposure in so many different markets, what are the most successful models that we can take and we can replicate no matter which country or economy we're talking about?
I mean, of course, things are different everywhere. But if you particularly, let's look at, how do we move towards net zero? Then you can see when you're putting new energy infrastructure in many of the developing countries and emerging markets, there now solar and sometimes wind are the cheapest choice. And that's because we've seen this incredible improvement in the price of solar, in the levelized cost of energy there. And we're going to continue to see that. So it's anywhere the sun shines. It's your cheapest form of energy. It's pretty much coming from solar now. So there's a leapfrog potential there. I actually do think we'll see that. And obviously you need electricity infrastructure for EVs. But I do think we'll see potential for leapfrogging there as well, in the same way as many countries, parts of the world sort of bypassed going from the old telephone system with cabled telephone straight to cellular. So I think we can see those opportunities. So there is a need for a whole set of things like capacity building, for the need to have really increased flows of investment into countries. And I think we're going to need a new level of public-private partnership where we have where we have countries, we have development banks, we have investors working together. And we've been looking at some of these, I'm sure Chris and the team as well. How do you actually increase financial flows in to get clean energy expanded into Africa, into South Asia, elsewhere?
And let's just extend on all of this for a moment, because I know that, of course, Temasek has been, and you've already outlined some of the major investments that Temasek has made in terms of technology that takes us into this net zero direction. What in particular do you think would help in those emerging economies when it comes to investments in the technology space? Things that really work. I mean, you're talking about anywhere the sun shines, but in terms of build out of infrastructure, it's still not that simple.
No, it's not, but you can see we're making progress on energy access. So there is improvements with energy access. And these are if you look at perhaps the poorest countries need the most effort. So it's the countries with the least infrastructure, the least capabilities need the most effort. And this is where I come back to what I just said in terms of you need collaboration between the countries themselves, development banks, international investors. But you can see capabilities building up. There's more and more entrepreneurs actually setting up really interesting business models, sort of pay-as-you-go solar systems that create those sort of models. And what you know, we can look at this from a climate perspective or from a poverty alleviation perspective. But the new technologies are offering solutions that were not really available before. But we need a laser focus on this, and particularly coming through a pandemic where the global economy has taken a beating and where we're short. You know, basically every country has kind of blown its budget. So we really need to double down on this and have a laser focus on it.
Okay, hopefully we can pick this up again with Chris. Chris, I know we had some audio problems, and I hope that we've managed to solve those. But there have been some really interesting questions around solar, for example. I know that Steve was just talking about some of the opportunities there in terms of renewable. But solar in the US, this is another anonymous question, exploded with the right policies and incentives. Are we anything like this in Asia that will help us catapult into real change? What's your view, Chris?
Well, I mean, I think that's obviously incredibly important. The kind of incentives that you see, it's made a huge difference. You say in the US, also in Europe, and if you look at the solar industry and the wind industry, they were both given a huge boost by the incentives in Germany, in particular, in the early part of this century. So I think they do help, but I also think that we're in a different world now where the incentives are needed much less. The fact is that solar and wind are now actually cheaper than fossil fuels in many situations. And as Steve said, when you're looking at disaggregated solar and wind in places like India or Africa or lots of the developing world, it's much easier to deploy than it is to go and put in many of the fossil fuel alternatives. The fact is, if you put a diesel generator into somewhere in the middle of Africa, you've still got to get the fuel there. Whereas you put a solar panel in there or a wind turbine, once it's in, it's going to be able to develop that energy sustainably. But at the same time, I think you need it's maybe not the incentives as much, the subsidies, but the actual the policy around that and the support the government gives, and the fact that they make it easier for people to do this. So I think that's it. It's the bureaucracy that you've got to change as well. So those are the sorts of things that I think that are going to be important. And I think once you clear the field and you make it obvious that actually this is not just the right thing to do, but it's the most economic thing to do, then I'm sure that we will see that investment come into Asia just as quickly as it's come into other parts of the world. And one thing we know that in Asia, people are entrepreneurial, and if they see an opportunity, they're going to exploit it. So I think we're in a position now where the opportunity to really scale this is huge. And again, you look at China and the amount of investment that they're putting into solar panels and into battery technology. And these two areas alone are going to have a massive impact on the ability for us to meet those targets. As Steve said earlier on, the ability for organisations like the IEA to be able to predict the cost decreases that we've seen in solar they've continually, unfortunately, missed their the actual reductions that we've seen. And again, even in the latest report, they're predicting that the speed of cuts in costs is going to fall quite dramatically, whereas it's also pretty clear that isn't always going to be the case. There's a lot of new stuff going on in solar around the way that wafers are being developed and the way that technology is being moved on and evolving. So I think there's still an awful lot more that can come out of solar. There's an awful lot more that's going to come out of batteries and the energy density that you're able to store within a battery. So these are all quite positive things. It's then making sure that that technology is deployed outside of just China, and that the other countries are able to collaborate and to deploy that technology across the world. And again, as Steve said, it'd be great if we can actually see the likes of Africa leapfrog, like they did with mobile telephony, and actually be able to use that infrastructure rather than having to put in place heavy cabling and the massive amount of infrastructure that you need to have a centrally distributed generation system.
Yeah, I want to pick up on a theme actually that you've been bringing out in that answer there, Chris, and pick it up with you, Steve. And the theme is around awareness, because a lot of this does depend on making sure there is that level of awareness, there's information sharing going on, and that people have access to the knowledge of the kind of change, and the kind of knowledge that helps us turn things upside down, to get back to the title of our panel. You've had a very interesting journey in sustainability, Steve. Can you tell us a little bit about that and the kind of lessons that you learned at IKEA previously that you're now being able to put into practice with Temasek, and where that's positioned you for your future goals and targets?
Thanks. It's a good question. At the risk, I'll go for one lesson to avoid going deeper. In IKEA, it's sort of my favorite lesson really is the power of 100% targets. So there's something and we looked at it. I said it was a TED talk I gave quite a few years ago. I said 100% targets basically create clarity. So if you have a 90% target, more than 10% of the business wants to be in the 10%. If you have a 50% target, are you backing the past or are you backing the future? You've got people totally confused. When you set 100% target, so 100% renewable energy, 100% EVs, 100% decarbonisation, whatever it is, you create complete clarity about what the future looks like, and it simplifies things for the business. And then we did that in lighting in IKEA. So we had a large lighting business, which was mostly selling halogens and compact fluorescents. And halogens are real heaters. They're incandescents with a different name, very inefficient. And we were selling a few thousand LEDs at that point in time, but we knew LEDs were the future. And they were 85% at that point in time, 85% more efficient. And you have to think in 2000, it was less than 1% of the lighting market. It was like something like 0.3% of the lighting market was LED. And this was just a couple of years after, and that's in 2010. And this was just a couple of years after that. So we set a target to go for 100% LEDs. And then we put all of our efforts. The next day, we stopped an investment in slightly better CFLs. We were going to invest in a factory to make slightly better CFLs, but that was no longer part of our future. And we did a root and branch transformation of the value chain. And I think IKEA were on track to meet their target of selling something like, I forgot I should remember the number, 100. I can no longer be held accountable for it. It was something like 100 million LEDs by 2020. And it drove tremendous growth and innovation because you were at the forefront of the technology. Because suddenly the lighting team, if you think, and this is it, we have to look at everything as a platform. When you have, decentralized renewable energy that's ubiquitous and cheap, incredibly, that creates, we suddenly got clean energy as a platform for business. You've got electric vehicles increasingly that will have a degree of autonomy to them that will be a new platform for business. So what are the new platforms that we see? You've got lighting, incredibly. When you go from an old-fashioned heater that produces a bit of light to an efficient, long-life LED, you can totally redesign lighting. So we redesigned lighting and it made that one of the fastest growing business areas in IKEA. So I think that's the sort of message you take from that is you have to decide what the future is and then go for it. You have to be clear about that. And if you're a policymaker, you're an investor, or you're a business leader, and this is the theme I think Chris and I have been talking about here, you can't look backwards anymore to look forwards. That's in an era of fast-going change. We have to say, okay, solar is going to be 60% cheaper. EVs are going to have the same sort of price improvement. We've got hydrogen coming through now with incredible investments behind hydrogen. We've got innovation where actually we're going from an old system where we very inefficiently produced protein through a cow, a catastrophically inefficient invention, the cow, from a greenhouse gas and resource use point of view. They're using, fermentation, lab-based approaches to a whole new industry of alternative proteins with tens of thousands of entrepreneurs now focused on that. So how do we look into the future and go all in for the future? Would be my objective lesson. And you have to know the future's coming faster than we think. And that's an exciting opportunity if you decide to lean into it.
I mean, that's really interesting. And I have to ask you, in the context of your new role, Steve, have you met any resistance? I mean, there are some people I've spoken to who've described, achieving SDGs as being in a fast-flowing river. But is it like that in practice? And do you ever have to come up against naysayers?
I think the world has switched. Of course, there are people there, but I think mainstream, the debate is over on science. The debate is over, do we need to do something about it? And that's widespread, across the business community. And capital markets have woken up now on this issue when I think they were a little bit slow to react. But now really capital market leaders are really leaning into this. So I think that you don't see many naysayers. It's that we still have a debate, and you can have a debate how fast things are moving, and with the sort of legacy industries, and there's going to be more and more legacy industries. If you look at the sort of anything that's resource intensive and carbon intensive is going to transition, if it's not transitioning already. So they're tomorrow's stranded assets, or they're stranded assets today. So we're going to have a rich debate about those and how fast do we move. And when the future, some of it on some things, you could say alternative proteins are still scaling. They don't represent the same scale of investment opportunity as traditional proteins. How do you migrate your investment into the future, and what the pace of change? So I'd say, rather than naysayers, it's a robust debate about how do you manage that change and that transition, and that's the right debate we should be having.
And on a practical note, sticking with that sort of theme, I want to pick it up with you, Chris. Hopefully we don't have the audio problems. But what is it that you tell your stakeholders, your clients, about what Standard Chartered is doing now to navigate this world that needs to turn its thinking upside down?
I think what we're saying is basically that there is the technology out there that's going to help with at least some of the requirements that we have to reduce carbon emissions. There are some gaps out there, but we believe that there will be, as Steve says, there's going to be innovation. There's going to be entrepreneurs who are going to take the opportunities that come their way. So we're going to do as much as we can to provide finance to companies to transition, for the companies that are already transitioning to make sure that they're able to thrive, and for those companies that are unable to transition, then we're going to have to work out ways of managing other ways to support them as the economy develops and as the economy decarbonizes. So we're going to be there every step of the way with companies, and we're trying to make sure that we provide the appropriate capital and we provide the appropriate signals to companies about what we're doing. I thought it was great, Steve's point about the 100% targets. I think that's the way that we have to approach things to ensure that there's a very clear message that's being put across to organisations, and that this is something that we really need to move quickly on now, and that we really need to do something about. But we're providing a lot of financing across all of our different industries. We've recently executed a sukuk with Etihad Airlines to support them on their sustainable link journey and their transition to support financing of new lower emissions aircraft. And then we're also getting involved in initiatives like SIX and like the Task Force for Scaling Voluntary Carbon Markets to ensure that companies know exactly what we think about the transition and what we need to do. So we're there to support companies and to ensure that the capital is there to support that transition.
Well, I think that's a great note for us to wrap up. I wish we just had 10 more minutes because we've had so many questions that I wanted to ask you both, including how do you account for risk and how do you measure risk in this scenario? But maybe we need another panel just on these sorts of questions. Thank you to our global audience for sending in all of these inquiries. And thank you to both of our panelists today, Dr. Steve Howard from Temasek and Chris Leeds joining us from London for Standard Chartered. It's been great speaking to you both. Lots of work has to be done. But from everything the both of you have said, there are a lot of options that can help turn things around. Gents, thank you so much. And to our audience everywhere, thank you too.